Welcome to FACT's webinar called Grazing Cover Crops for Profits. Our presenter today is Meghan Filbert with Practical Farmers of Iowa. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining us. So I'd like to begin just with a few quick introductions. FACT is a national nonprofit organization that's headquartered in Illinois. We promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a number of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers, and this webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. Please visit our website to learn more about all of our other farmer services. This time, I am very pleased to introduce our esteemed presenter, Meghan Filbert. Meghan is the Livestock Program Manager with Practical Farmers of Iowa, or PFI for short. Her work focuses on grazing systems and specifically on the integration of ruminant livestock into cropping systems. Outside of her work with PFI, Meghan raises a flock of hair sheep on a vegetable farm for soil fertility, vegetable management, vegetation management and meat production. We are incredibly lucky to have her with us tonight to share her experience and her expertise on the topic of profitable grazing of cover crops. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Meghan so that she may begin her presentation. Meghan, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Larissa. And it's great to see so many people from all over the country tuning in tonight. So like Larissa said, I'm going to speak on grazing cover crops for profit and share some on-farm research from Iowa farmers that has taken place over the last 4 years and kind of the economic numbers that we've analyzed and discovered from this on-farm research. I do want to make a statement that this webinar won't really touch on the how to graze cover crops. There are plenty of resources out there on how to graze these covers, but this is specifically more on how to quantify that forage value and to provide you some tools on quantifying the value that we see from cover crops and how we can find profits in planting and grazing covers. So just a bit before I get into the meat of the presentation, I do want to introduce Practical Farmers of Iowa to all of you that may not be familiar. So Practical Farmers of Iowa is a nonprofit based in central Iowa in Ames, the same town as Iowa State University. We were founded in 1985, and our mission is to equip farmers to build resilient farms and communities. We do this through a series of field days, our annual conference every year in January here in Ames, and also through on-farm research. We work in the areas of livestock, horticulture, field crops, cover crops, beginning farmers, conservation, and we work with land transfer, passing land down to the next generation of farmers. And like I mentioned, we specialize in on-farm research. So really, this was how PFI was born through farmers who wanted to answer their own questions. Instead of listening to people come on their farm and try to sell them things, they wanted to set up on-farm experiments to answer what they were curious about. So last year, in 2018, we had 54 farmer cooperators taking part in 77 different research trials, including grazing cover crop trials, which is what I'll speak on today. So to get started, firstly, why graze cover crops? We know that cover crops are somewhat costly to plant, and with corn and soybean prices as low as they are, it's sometimes hard to justify the cost of those cover crops. But when we graze them, we can add value to those cover crops in many ways. So the reasons for grazing cover crops, one is to extend your grazing season in the fall and also in the early spring. So right now in Iowa, the perennial pastures are just now starting to green up, but it's really too early to let your livestock out on those pastures for if you want to practice proper grazing management. So this is a time when farmers are now putting up some temporary fence and grazing cereal rye cover crop that they had seeded last fall. So cover crops can really help provide relief to spring pastures and help you not turn out your cows or other livestock too early on those perennial pastures, because it sure is tempting. Another big reason farmers plant cover crops is specifically cereal rye, which is a species that overwinters, it vernalizes, and it comes up in the spring. It starts growing at about 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's the first thing to green up in the spring, and it provides a fresh, clean spring calving pasture. So many farmers have told me that this is really the number one reason they started planting cereal rye, because they've been able to lower their vet bills and avoid calving in what normally is a muddy season or in a muddy lot. So then again, and what I'm going to talk about today is we graze cover crops to save money and reduce the reliance we have on stored winter feed. When you're out grazing cover crops in row crop fields, you're depositing manure where you need it, so the livestock are acting as your manure spreader, and you're also helping to increase the carrying capacity of your land. So we know that grazing cover crops adds value, and there's two different types of value that I want to explore. So the majority of what we'll talk about today is about the economic returns that cover crops allow within that same year of planting, but also we did conduct some research around the soil health benefits of integrating livestock into row crop acres. I also want to mention that what I'm going to talk about today is planting and grazing cover crops within a dominant corn and soybean system. When we diversify our landscape and plant other crops, such as small grains, other than just corn and soybeans, the windows of opportunity become a lot wider, and there's so many more possibilities for forage planting and grazing. So we know cover crops add value, but how much value exactly? So when I went down this path of trying to quantify the economics of grazing cover crops, I'd ask farmers how if they know how much money they may be saving in winter feed and how they do the math. And it's all across the board. Most of the time, farmers have a good idea on how much it costs to feed their livestock per head per day over the winter, and they just know approximately how much money they're able to save in winter feed costs by grazing cover crops. But a lot of times when farmers were reporting these numbers, they looked better than they actually were because they weren't taking out their input costs, such as the cost of the cover crop seed and the cost of application of that cover crop. So I worked with farmers and an economist at Iowa State to devise a tool to be able to account for all of those costs, which is what I'll share today. So I do want to draw your attention to this research report that's available for free on Practical Farmers of Iowa's website, practicalfarmers.org, under research reports. So it's titled The Economic Impact of Grazing Cover Crops in Cow-Calf Operations. So this is really what the first round of research that we did, and we're currently conducting more research around the economics and soil health. We've kept it going. So this project started in 2015. It'll run until 2021. We're working with 7 different farmer cooperators, and it was funded by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship through a water quality initiative project. The objective of this research project was to demonstrate the economic benefits of utilizing cover crops as forage on integrated crop and cattle farms. So the three farmers that I'm going to talk about all are cow-calf operators and also have row crops. So to just set the stage for how we were able to do these calculations, so we know the dry matter requirements of cattle during cover crop grazing periods. And for the sake of this presentation and this research, a cover crop grazing period was about, it started in October, early November, potentially later, and then continued throughout the late fall, winter, and into early spring, with potentially a winter break in between when there was too much snow on the ground or ice on the ground, when cattle were pulled in and fed in a lot somewhere or bale grazed. But I'm not going to specifically cover research on grazing summer annual cover crops. We're really talking about winter annuals within the corn and soybean systems. I just wanted to reiterate that again. So we know that cattle require about 3% of their body weight in dry matter every day. So I had farmers record the number of cows in their herd that were grazing cover crops, the average weight of those cows, and we took that number times 4%. So that 4% accounts for a 2.5 to 3% daily intake of dry matter, a 0.5% for trampling loss, and a 0.5 to 1% of a buffer. And that's an NRCS recommendation of 4%. And then we take that number times the number of days they were out grazing that cover crop. Just to specify, we did not actually weigh animals when they went into the field and when they came back out of the field. We used animals' average weights, and we assumed they maintained weight while they were on that cover crop. So for a quick calculation here, let's say we have 20 cows that are each about 1,200 pounds. They're going to require 4% of their body weight. So this herd of 20 cows needs 960 pounds of dry matter. If we take 960 pounds of dry matter and we times that by 10 days, they were out grazing cover crops for 10 days, they're going to require 9,600 pounds of dry matter over that 10-day grazing period. I also had farmers account for any sort of supplemental feed that they may have been feeding in addition to the cover crop forage that was out in the field. So I could take that supplemental feed out of this equation. So how I was able to value the cover crop forage was I simply put a price to that forage of the current market price for hay or what other feed stuff they may be feeding. So in Iowa, it may have been dried distiller's grain, corn silage, etc. I was able to find the current market price for hay through the USDA Ag Marketing Service website, which is here on the page. For the sake of this research, when I analyzed this data, hay costs about $80 a ton in Iowa. Since then, it's gone up significantly. Last year, we had a hay shortage and it was close to $150 a ton. So keep in mind when I'm reporting these numbers that I was using $80 a ton, and if these numbers were analyzed last year, the profits would have doubled and looked a lot better. So really, these numbers are conservative. So more to explain the methods of this research. So I did allude to that we needed to account for all of the costs involved when using and grazing cover crops. So that means we needed to account for the cover crop seed, application, and the termination costs for these cover crops. We need to account for grazing labor and account for grazing infrastructure, fence, and water. I did put a disclaimer here. If the same costs would have been spent grazing corn stalks with no cover crops, or if the same amount of herbicide would have been used on those fields, regardless of cover crops present or not during termination, those costs were not included. So we only included costs that were fair to charge to the cover crop expenses. So I know this is a lot of numbers, but I want to draw your attention to the numbers down here listed in the red circles. So you can see that there, I want you to look at the rows with the first red circle. So under total net economic gain or loss in that row, our economic gains ranged from $1.56 per acre profits to $60.09 per acre. So you can see that there's a wide range of profits from these three different farmers, but that's really attributed to different management styles of grazing, different planting dates, and their experience with cover crops. The second red circle, the lowest one on the page, looks at these net gain or losses without cost share included. So I should mention that when figuring this economic analysis, we included the amount of money these farmers received from NRCS cost share as a form of revenue, because these farmers planted cover crops, so they were able to reap the benefits of federal and state cost share dollars for planting these cover crops, and that is a form of revenue. But we really wanted to look at these net gain or losses if cost share wasn't included. Someday we may not have cost share to rely on. So we need to make sure we can tweak our management to remain profitable. So with that being said, we see that Wesley Degner, this first farmer here in the left-hand columns, he actually lost money. He lost $23 to $37 per acre. We see that Bill Frederick profited $8.96, and then the next year lost $11.26 per acre. And then Mark Schleisman, this farmer whose columns are on the far right, was still able to profit about $27 per acre both years, even if cost share wasn't a factor. And really, when we pick apart these profits and losses, there's a story behind this. So Wesley Degner, it was a first-time cover crop user and also a first-time cover crop grazer. Wesley planted cereal rye, and as soon as it started to come up and green up in the fall, he turned his cattle out. That was really too soon to start grazing cover crops. If he would have let that cereal rye grow more biomass, there would have been more forage to graze, and he would have reaped the benefit of more grazing days. Therefore, potentially having to feed less hay or less winter feed. Bill Frederick has been using cover crops for about 5 years. That first year, he profited, and that second year, he lost money. That second year, he had additional herbicide termination costs to kill cereal rye, which he didn't have the year prior because he planted a winter kill cover crop, which was full of brassicas that did not overwinter. So that second year, his winter termination costs and the herbicide that he had to use to terminate the cereal rye outweighed the grazing profits from his spring grazing. And Mark Schleisman has been planting and grazing over 1,000 acres of cover crops for over a decade and has been able to tweak his management to get his cover crop, interseed his cover crop very early and also wait to graze. And he's figured out how to be profitable without cost share. So just to go back to that story about Bill Frederick, his example was in the middle two columns. In 2017, the value of his spring forage equated to $457, but his termination costs exceeded that. His termination herbicide cost $1,360. Bill Frederick says that spring calving young pairs and the health benefits of fresh pasture to calves is worth more than the value of that forage. He thinks that rye fields keep calves clean and dry in the spring. And just another quote from Bill: "The way you make money from cover crops is from decreased inputs, not increased yields." So to add to Mark Schleisman's story, since that report came out, I've been able to analyze more of his numbers from 2017 and 2018. So his base cover crop seed mix consists of triticale, rye, rapeseed, radish, and oats, which cost him $23 per acre. He then drills those cover crops or air seeds them with a modified highboy, which is pictured here, for $9.50 per acre. So when we were able to run his numbers for this past year, without cost share, per acre, he profited $107 per animal unit, which is an animal unit is 1,000 pounds of animal. He profited $89 per acre. Over all of his acres, that added up to about $117,000 on his farm. Or we could look at that number as $117,000 that he was able to save in winter feed. When we take cost share out of the equation, he still profited $87 per acre or $71 per animal unit, totaling about $94,000 of winter feed expenses he did not have to incur. We also were able to look at that number by cost saved per animal unit per day when grazing cover crops, and that equated to $1.84 per animal unit per day. Mark Schleisman says he started planting cereal rye because it was easy to calve in, and now most of all their covers are grazed as a way to justify costs. I had mentioned that one reason to graze cover crops is to increase the carrying capacity of your land. Mark Schleisman says that his dad ran 200 cow-calf pairs on the same acres they now run 360 pairs on. Because they graze cover crops, they're producing more on the same amount of land. So I'd like to draw your attention to where you could potentially find this tool to run these numbers on your own farm. This tool is published on Iowa State University's Ag Decision Maker, which is free and open to the public. It can be found at extension.iastate.edu or by Googling Ag Decision Maker. And under that page on the left-hand side, you'll find a tab called Crops. And under Cost and Return and Profitability, you will find a link to the Excel spreadsheet tools for the economics of cover crops. So Once you open this Excel file, I do want to point out that there are 3 different spreadsheet tools. One is a tool on the economics of cover crops without grazing or mechanically harvesting for feed. So just straight costs and benefits of planting cover crops. The next is a budgeting tool for looking forward into the future. It's the projected economic costs and benefits of cover crops with grazing or harvesting. So using that tool, you will have to fill in some assumptions on biomass production you think you'll get with cover crops and how many cattle you'll think you'll graze for how many days. And then the last spreadsheet, which is the tool that I specifically used to analyze this data, is the actual economic costs and benefits resulting from cover crops, including grazing or harvesting. So this is where I was able to take actual on-farm data that had been recorded from years prior and enter it into cells into an Excel spreadsheet. So like I said, these are the 3 different tabs that you will see and can choose from when using this tool. And I don't want to bore you by going through this tool, but just a screenshot of the summary that you will see, which is essentially all of your revenue minus your costs, which equals your net profit or your forage value of cover crops. And you'll be able to see this value on a per acre basis and a per animal unit basis. I do want to mention that there are several values that are not accounted for when using this tool. These are values that are harder to quantify, such as the nutritional value of different types of cover crop forage. Radish, turnips, and forage kale has a different forage value than cereal rye. That is not accounted for in this tool. Manure deposition and the fertility you may be receiving from grazing is not accounted for. The animal effect of grazing on plants and the root growth is also not accounted for. Cattle and calf health and potentially your decreased inputs from decreased veterinary bills is not accounted for. And also that advantage of being able to rest your perennial pastures by grazing cover crops is not included in this spreadsheet tool. So now I want to transition to the benefits of soil health and some of the on-farm research that the preliminary data from on-farm research that we have started to do here in Iowa. These benefits to the soil are what are going to create future profits on your farm. We know that soil health benefits are more of our long-term future benefits, but at some point in the future, they will reap economic benefits to you and your farm. So Practical Farmers of Iowa was involved in a project with the Pasture Project, which is a facet of the Wallace Winrock Center out of Washington, D.C. This project was funded under a federal conservation innovation grant through NRCS. And we collected 4 years of soil data from 8 different farms. 2 of those farms were farms in Iowa, and 6 of those farms were in Minnesota. This work took place from 2015 to 2018. And when I share the results in the next 2 slides, control means soil samples taken from corn and soybean fields that had no cover crops planted in them. And our treatment was corn and soybean fields with a 6 species cover crop mix that included 2 legumes, 2 brassicas, and 2 forbs. And those cover crops were grazed. So that's the difference between our control and treatment in this project. And here's a snapshot of one of the cooperators measuring cover crop biomass in the fall. You can see some legumes and grasses in that pasture. And not only did we take soil health samples using a soil probe, we also measured compaction using a penetrometer. It's very common that farmers believe that grazing cover crops will result in compaction in their row crop fields, which may hinder their cash crop growth and hinder yields. So we wanted to put this to the test. So we used a penetrometer across both our control and treatment fields. And you can see that in 2015, on the far left here, the red line stands for our grazed cover crops, which is our treatment, and the blue line is our control, no cover crops and no grazing. So vertically, if you can see here on the left side, 0 to 24 represents our depth, soil depth in inches. So we were able to we took a penetrometer to measure compaction down to 24 inches in the soil. The top axis here shows the pressure it took to use that, to push that penetrometer into the soil. And that was recorded in PSI. So you can see that in 2015, that's our baseline test when no cover crops, no cover crops had been planted and no grazing had taken place, that compaction levels in both our control and treatment fields were similar. Our treatment field had just a slight, our control field had just a slight amount more compaction than our treatment. You can see the differences in 2016 to 2017. And then in 2018, after 3 years of grazing, we can see that there's less compaction in our grazed cover crop fields. The asterisk between each line represents statistical significance. So we concluded that cover crops and grazing significantly lessened compaction in row crop fields. So then I also wanted to show the soil health data from combined soil health data from all 8 farms in the study, 2 in Iowa and 6 in Minnesota. And the readings that I wanted to point out are those circled in red. So OM stands for organic matter. TC is total carbon, which is inorganic and organic carbon combined. And TLMB is total living microbial biomass. Total living microbial biomass is a number of all of the biomass and the microbes living in the soil, the more the better. So really for all of these numbers, organic matter, carbon, and total living microbial biomass, the higher the number, the better. So I do want to point out that for organic matter, our average control was 3.86% organic matter, and our treatment was 3.97%. Treatment was just slightly higher. For total carbon at these 8 farms, our average carbon was 289 nanograms per gram versus in our treatment, the average carbon was 338 nanograms per gram. And you can see that total living microbial biomass was also higher in our treatment fields. All of these results and a how-to guide on grazing cover crops are listed on the Pasture Project website page. pastureproject.org. I had talked that this presentation is not how to graze cover crops, but there is this newly published guide to serve as a tool for how to graze different cover crops. That guide was authored by Alan Williams. So I want to conclude with the lessons learned from this on-farm research project, which is in all cases, profits from fall and winter cover crop grazing exceeded spring grazing alone. And that is really due to, in Iowa at least, is due to a larger grazing window in the fall and the winter, and a shorter grazing window in the spring. So the grazing window in the spring is short because cover crops, which are just now starting to come on, really only have several weeks to be grazed before farmers are going to try to get into that same field to plant corn. For grazing cover crops prior to planting soybeans, there is a larger window of grazing opportunity. We learned that spring termination costs can exceed the value of spring grazing in some cases. We also learned that cost share can make it or break it in terms of profitability. We know that the early establishment of cover crops, interseeding by highboy cedar, by plane, is good for biomass growth, but you also want to wait to graze that cover crop until there's plenty of biomass for your herd. We learned that grazing cover crops has the potential to put money back in your pocket within the same year of planting. And we know that roots in the ground, active grazing, and manure all contribute to soil health. I do want to mention year-round grazing. So cover crops, another name for cover crops is also annual forages. They're sometimes used interchangeably. And we know that we can pair cover crops or annual forages with perennial pastures to create year-round grazing opportunities or forage chains. Annual forages can be used on the shoulders of the grazing season, so in spring, fall, and then also they could be planted to get you through the summer slump. Many grazing systems, especially in warm environments, have to endure a summer slump where cool season grasses productivity slows down. That's where summer annuals could really provide optimum grazing opportunities. In Iowa, that would be in August and early September. So when I mentioned summer annuals, that those are sorghum Sudan grass, millet, sunflower, sun hemp, and many others. And then again, cover crops or annual forages can be stockpiled or even baled to then be fed in when you need winter feed or stored feed. So we know that this type of work and grazing cover crops is really catching on. Just here's a few examples of articles highlighting the practice in popular farming publications. And also I'd like to mention the practice of contract grazing or custom grazing. I believe that contract grazing is really a win-win for both cattle owners, livestock owners, grazers, and row croppers. And this is truly an opportunity for beginning farmers. In Iowa, we have to deal with very high farmland costs, and it's very hard for beginning farmers to get started through owning their own farmland. So by pairing existing landowners and row croppers with grazers through cover crops, that's really an excellent opportunity to get started grazing. I realize that there's a fact sheet on this page that's hidden by this screenshot of Greg Judy's book, but there's a fact sheet on contract grazing of cover crops on the Practical Farmers of Iowa website. And I just wanted to point to Greg Judy as an example of a farmer who got started through custom grazing, solely through custom grazing. He did not start farming by owning his own land. And he's been able to create a profitable business and still continue farming 30 years later. I also did want to introduce some of you who may not be familiar to the idea of a virtual fence. So virtual fence for livestock is currently used in Australia and Scandinavia and some other countries outside of the United States. We don't quite have the technology in the US currently, but it is being developed by several different companies. And so really what this is where livestock wear a collar or an ear tag, and that collar is pinging off of a base station that is then using a satellite and satellite GPS. And so it's not like a dog fence that's buried under the ground. This is all via satellite. And what you do is change fence boundaries from your smartphone through an application. So when an animal gets close to the boundary that you've set, it'll start to beep or give them an audible signal. And then when that animal crosses that boundary or is on that boundary, it sends a small shock, electrical shock to them. So I really feel as though virtual fence has great implications for grazing our country, but specifically for use on row crop acres where fence has been taken out or is in disrepair. A major obstacle that we have in grazing more, in integrating more livestock on Iowa's landscape, is that the fence was all taken down to make way for larger fields of corn and soybeans. So a lot of farmers aren't willing to invest in new fence, but virtual fence could provide that opportunity to just reintegrate livestock on more acres in Iowa and all over our country for that matter. So with that being said, we have 10 more minutes. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. And here's my contact information for any of you that may have follow-up questions and want to comment or need any clarification. I'd be happy to be in touch with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. This is Larissa again. That was excellent presentation. I was lucky enough to see a similar presentation this winter at the Grassworks conference. So we do have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So if folks want to ask anything for more information or something that questions that came up from Megan's presentation, please type into that left-hand chat bar. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the questions out loud so that everyone knows what's being asked, and then Megan will be able to respond. So let's see. We have a question. The question is, in the study which looked at soil compaction, I was curious about the number of replications within the study. Was it just 8 farms, or were there subplots, trials on each farm to increase the number of replications?
Yes, Jonah Lynn. So on each of the 8 farms, there was a treatment and a control, and specifically for the soil compaction, 10 different samples were taken from each treatment and each control every year. So there were replications of when using the soil penetrometer.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Let's see. Looking for questions. I know that I will be sending around, in addition to the slides that we were presented tonight and this recording, there are some other resources that Megan mentioned. I'll send out links to those. And there are also a couple other webinars that have been previously recorded that I will also share with everyone that might be helpful for some of the practical how-tos. Let's see.
So Larissa, I did
Yes.
get a question from Robert in Tennessee about cattle weights and assuming they maintain the same weight. The reason we didn't weigh these animals was because we were conducting this research on cow-calf farms. So really, we were doing research with cows, mama cows, mostly prior to calving. So therefore, those cattle, since they're not necessarily feeders or finishers, we assumed they were maintaining an average weight. In the spring, if they were grazing cows with their calf pairs, we included the average calf weight in our calculations.
Excellent. Good. Thanks for following up on that. It came in earlier in the presentation. So question, let's see. I've heard that stockpiling fields for winter grazing, about it. In the study, you did not promote or utilize winter grazing. Is there an outstanding reason or reasons why you wait until spring?
Oh, in the study we did. There was fall, winter, and spring grazing. A lot of times these farmers were leaving their cattle, turning them out in around Thanksgiving into their cover crops, and were grazing through different paddocks of cover crops all the way up until spring. So there was winter grazing.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. So we have a question. Are there any studies using small ruminants in cover crops forage?
That is a great question. I know that I'm blanking on his name right now. He is a professor or extension staffer in Michigan who has done a lot of work on grazing cover crops with sheep. His name is Richard Earhart. And I know on the Practical Farmers of Iowa website, we hosted a webinar with him on grazing cover crops, titled Grazing Cover Crops with Sheep. And it's archived and available, so you could find that on our website.
Excellent. I'll try to find that too and send it out with the other resources. Let's see what's come in. We have a couple of actually questions about the herbicides in the spring. I'm not sure if I can combine them or not, but we'll take them one at a time. Question is, if one does the fall winter, do you have to use herbicides to kill them off before spring?
I'm curious, does that mean fall winter grazing? So it depends on the species of cover crops that is planted. So there are species of cover crops such as oats and turnips that could be planted in August, September, October, come up pretty vigorously in the fall, and then not survive over winter. And therefore, herbicides would not need to be used to terminate cover crops. When I talk about using herbicides to terminate, I'm talking about to terminate cereal rye, which is a cover crop that overwinters. It's winter hardy, and it needs to be terminated in the spring. these farmers used herbicide to terminate. These were not on organic farms. Other farmers may be terminating by plowing, or if there's potential to use a roller crimper to kill cover crops when they've gone to maturity. But in that case, there would be some finessing to do on being able to graze and terminate by roller crimping. So really, you may be able to graze early in the fall, but then not graze any longer to ensure that that cereal rye reaches the stage it needs to in the spring to be effectively terminated by roller crimping. So there's some nuances there and management techniques that are needed when you're trying to terminate in an organic system.
And then as a kind of a follow-up to that, since we're kind of on that, have you seen any research? There's a question asking between organic land versus land that is sprayed in terms of, sounds like, yes, the research did take into account the farms that did spray. And the question is if there's any result difference in biological activity that was measured, if there is kind of those comparison studies that you've seen.
That's a really great question about the soil health in organic versus non-organic farms. So part of that pasture project work, I mentioned that there are 8 farms involved. Several of those farms in Minnesota, whether or not they're certified organic, I don't believe they terminated with herbicides. And that research can all be found on the Pasture Project website. And I believe you can find it broken down by farm and their practices. So you'd be able to look at the potential differences in total living microbial biomass and the different parameters that we studied on for this specific project.
Excellent. Yes, that's wonderful. So I'm looking to see if there are any last questions. Does anyone
One
have
more question up here I see. Any ideas on which types of cover crops work for quote unquote grass-fed cattle? So I'm assuming you mean, grass-fed and grass-finished. So really all cover crops in their vegetative stage are going to work in a grass finishing scenario. It's just that when you grow cover crops, if you let them grow to a certain stage of maturity, they are going to set a seed head. And depending on your feeding protocol or your grass-fed claim that you're going to make, you may need to graze those annual forages before they set seed, or else that would be considered grain fed. So there's some you have to read the fine print and think about management and grazing timing for those annual forages to stay vegetative.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that distinction. So we are just about out of time. I do have just a few housekeeping items to share before we sign off tonight. Immediately following this webinar, you will be asked to complete a very, very, very brief survey. If you have an extra minute, we'd really greatly appreciate it if you take the time to complete it. Just tell us about your experience, how we can improve, if there are topics for the future that you'd like to see addressed. And also a recording of the webinar and the slides will be available very soon. I'll be sending those out tomorrow and also archiving them on the FACT website. I'd like to call your attention to just a few more webinars that we have coming up this spring. In May, Annie Warmke will be back to talk about how to run a successful intern program on your farm. And then also in May, we are hopefully almost 100% likely to be hosting a session on solar grazing, which will most likely be the first week in May. That date is still TBD, but we're hoping that we'll have that scheduled very, very soon. So stay tuned on that one. Megan, do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to share before I close the webinar?
I just want to thank everyone. And for specific questions, please contact me at Meghan, Meghan, at practicalfarmers.org.
Perfect. Yep. So on that note, that is all the time we have. Thank you, Megan, so much for that fantastic presentation and spending your evening with us. I'd like to also thank everyone in our audience for your attention and your interest. I certainly hope that you'll join us on a future webinar. So have a wonderful evening and stay in touch. Goodbye.